This is Curious Minnesota, a Star Tribune project that sends staff from the state's largest newsroom hunting for the answers to great questions we receive from you, our readers. We're here to answer everything you want to know about the state's people, places, and culture.
Welcome to Curious Minnesota. I'm your host, Eric Roper. Today's episode of Curious Minnesota is sponsored by Primrose Schools. Before we start today's show, I just want to give a little update on what I've been up to, just in case anybody's been wondering where I've been. And it's fine if you have not been wondering that. The reason I've been a bit absent lately on the podcast is because I'm working on a major project with Star Tribune audio producer Melissa Townsend. I think listeners of this podcast are going to like it because A, it's a podcast, and B, it's about history. And it will also be the Star Tribune's first narrative podcast. This has been in the works for more than 4 years, and I am very excited to share it with the world this January. We'll be posting a trailer before then in this feed to give you a little preview, and we will, of course, be letting you know where you can find it. Okay, on to today's show, which is about a topic that we're all familiar with, but if you're like me, you never really thought much about it. I'm talking about rest areas, those spots along the highway that are designed to give drivers a place to pause their journey. It turns out we have some pretty nice rest areas in this state, and they serve an important purpose. Reader Mark Thompson wanted to know more about the process of designing and locating them.
I'm curious about the process, both in terms of the politics and in terms of the engineering. How is it decided where they are, and what is the process for designing a wayside rest?
Thanks to Mark for that question. Joining me today is Erica Pearson, who wrote a story on this topic for Curious Minnesota. Well, Erica, welcome.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Yeah. So, all right. We were talking about this story before you did it. And I think at the time I was like, maybe. I guess I don't stop at enough rest stops to think about this. Tell me on why a listener should spend the next couple minutes here learning about rest stops if we have not thought much about this topic.
So you go on a road trip, you're driving along, all of a sudden you need to make a stop. And if you're in Minnesota, chances are the place where you pull over is going to have beautiful bathrooms, nicely maintained. If you have a dog, you can let them run around in an off-leash area. Your kids can go climb on the playground, and it's a great spot to take a break. But not every state has as nice and as attractive of rest areas as we do here in Minnesota.
And I think I was kind of eye-rolling at that maybe early on, but then the commenters, they had every opportunity to like kind of rip this story to shreds, and they really were like, oh no, we have some of the best rest areas in the country. I mean, it's a subjective question, but it seems like people seem to agree that there is something going on here.
Yeah, Iowa has nice ones too. We can admit that. But,
okay.
Yeah.
And there are gas stations everywhere, because that's where I stop. So why is that not fine?
Well, you can't have a picnic at a gas station, Eric. You can't.
Yeah, that would be kind of unpleasant.
It would be awkward.
And so this is good for families. Before we get into the history, just tell us, you grew up stopping at rest stops.
Yes.
In this region, not maybe this state so much. You're from Wisconsin.
Yeah.
We should put that out there.
Yeah.
Okay.
So drive to Bemidji, drive to Omaha, bring the picnic lunch, make a stop.
At the rest stop.
Yep.
Not some gas station.
Got to make sure there's a picnic table available.
And they would be like a packed lunch?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Cheese sandwich was what my mom would do, but
Okay.
Yeah.
So these are important. Okay. As you note in the story, there's sort of like a tourism aspect to this. I mean, we don't think about it that way, but this is sort of a somewhat of a prominent landmark for a certain type of person, this traveler who's coming right through the state.
Yeah. Minnesota Department of Transportation folks like to say that it might be the only place in Minnesota that some people visit. That's true. And also some of the rest areas are welcome centers where you can stop and talk with somebody from our tourism board and pick up pamphlets, make some decisions about what you're going to do here.
Okay. Are it rest stops or rest areas?
You know, rest areas is generally what they
That's the
say,
technical
but
jargon?
you can call them what you want, but yeah, rest areas. There's rest areas, wayside rest stops. They all kind of fall in this category.
Okay, so there's different types. Let's just get to the two main ones. How many have a toilet is the real question.
That's a good way to break them down. So there are 62 rest areas in Minnesota with a toilet that MnDOT owns and operates, and then there's 65 more that are wayside rests where you can pull over. There may be a spot to take a picture, stretch your legs.
Okay, yeah, that's fine. There's a place to go to the bathroom or not. But what's the point of all this? What is the mission here that MnDOT is carrying out?
Yes, and that's what reader Mark Thompson actually was especially curious about, why the rest stops are located where they are. And it has to do with driver safety and, of course, the safety of the other folks on the road. But they've done studies and found that if rest areas are located about 50 to 60 miles apart along the roadsides, it can help alleviate drowsy driving, distracted driving. Jenny Krantz, who manages the state's rest areas, was saying that also they're imagining you may have children in the back who are distracting you and need a break, need to stretch their legs. Or if you have a dog, all of these things can have a factor in a driver's safety. So, yeah,
Okay.
Spot to stop.
Got it. Okay, so this is about driver safety. Okay, so going back into the chronology here, we really start in the 1930s. You know that there was a huge travel boom. Tell me about them initially, because it seems like some of them have changed a bit, but like what was sort of the initial vibe of these rest stops?
Yeah, so Minnesota was one of the early states to really capitalize on automobile tourism. It's a beautiful state, so it makes sense. But what they would do is they worked with the Minnesota Historical Society, who put in some historical markers or spots near a river or also on the North Shore where you have a place to pull over and have a drink of water, check your vehicle, but also you might want to take in the view, check out some of the history in the area.
That's interesting, though, that they had those markers. It was like, okay, you're going to stop and you're going to learn something about this state.
Yes.
But then also, because your car back then was probably not great. There's a great quote in the story describing why you might pull over in the 1930s.
Yeah, so Andrea Weber, who works for MnDOT and manages their historic rest stops and waysides, she was telling me, here's a quote, "If you think of a 1930s vintage vehicle, it's pretty rough riding and they break down a lot. Their tires burst a lot. So they would need places to stop and do repairs, pour some water in the engine, drink some water, have a picnic, all those things."
And there's a photo on the story of the Cascade River wayside in 1935. And when I saw it, even though I've said, like, I don't pay a ton of attention to these, I was like, yep, I know exactly where that is. I've been there. This is between Duluth and Grand Marais. One of the most beautiful rest stops probably in the state, although I don't know, maybe you can tell me. But it looks basically exactly the same as it is. It's just like, it's basically a pullover where you can look at the lake, essentially.
Yeah. And Andrea said that Minnesota actually was ahead of the curve in developing these places, and that is her favorite rest area in the state.
Okay, so if any of our listeners are going to Grand Marais or going to the Boundary Waters, which is usually why I'm on this road, make sure you, if you have a need to pull over for a second or you just want to take a couple photos or something like that, the Cascade River Wayside between Duluth and Grand Marais is a great one. And that's just a great drive in general if you haven't taken that drive. We'll be right back.
At Primrose, our balanced learning approach means exploring academic skills and life skills, combining purposeful play with nurturing guidance from teachers, and setting children up for success in future classrooms. Learn more at primroseschools.com/Twin Cities.
And we're back. Okay, we talked about the toilets and lack of toilets. There's also a class system within rest stops. Not to get too technical here, but just explain there's class 1 rest stops. How would I know if I was in a class 1 rest stop? And how many of those are there?
So there's 50 of them, and you would know that you're in a class 1 rest area if there's a flush toilet and if it's warm in the winter, cool in the summer. Yeah.
And some of them on the borders even are sort of like tourism centers.
Yeah, they're called welcome centers. Yes.
And what does that mean?
And that means that someone from the state's tourism board will be there answering questions. They sort of have office hours where they're behind a booth and they have different brochures and things people can pick up.
I like that. It's
Yeah.
like, I'm new to your state. Where can I go around here? Well,
Yeah.
here's some brochures. I mean, that's probably an actual conversation that happens.
I'm sure.
Yeah. Okay. So there's only 50 of those. I mean, that's not that many. So what is like the majority of these rest stops then?
Yeah, so there's a few more that are seasonal and there's just like a vault toilet and they don't maintain those so that they don't need to like plow them out and so on in the winter. So those shut down. And then the largest number are wayside rests, which are just a spot to pull over.
Isn't that what that Cascade River one is? So
Exactly.
it's just a cool little scenic, maybe not scenic always, but just a place to pull over.
Yes.
Got it. Okay. So part of the reason we got into this story was about the sort of exceptionalism of these rest stops. And if people click on the link in the show notes, they'll see some of the photos. I mean, some of these have become sort of architecturally significant spaces. So tell us about some of these sort of standout rest areas.
Yeah, so in about the past 5 years or so, MnDOT has been going through the properties and updating them. And there's a whole host of criteria that they use, including like how many people stop there every year, accessibility, whether things need to be brought up to current standards and the building condition. And that determines what rises to the top and could be remodeled. Some of them are torn down and completely rebuilt. And quite a few of them actually won awards from the local chapter of the American Institute of Architects. And there's some that look a little like a museum. There's one near Owatonna on I-35 called the Straight River Northbound Safety Rest Area. That reminds...
What a beautiful name.
I know, right? Anyway, it reminds me of the Weissman. It has that kind of shiny, steel-clad exterior, and it's very beautifully landscaped. Very cool.
Which is like a Frank Gehry design building. Not this spot, but the Weissman is. And he's like a avant-garde architect. So anyway, the point is like these are showcases of architecture in some way.
They are. That one is by Snow Krellick Architects, and it won an award the year it opened. And one of the jurors, this is juror Mimi Wang, she said, "It's the most exquisite rest area building I've ever seen. The only problem is that it would be a very long time before I got back into my car to drive."
Wow. I'm just looking at a photo of it now. The main distinction between this and like the Weissman is that it's not as curvy. It's more of a modern, angular look, right?
And a lot smaller.
And a lot smaller. Yeah, and there's no art in it. Or maybe there is, actually. I guess I shouldn't say that.
Some of them actually do have art in them.
Okay.
Yes, there's some by Jackson that have some beautiful prints by a famous Minnesotan photographer.
So they have some museum qualities.
Yes.
So there's one, I'm looking at a photo of Goose Creek. Again, this is on the story. This is up near Duluth, or is it on the way to Duluth on 35?
Yeah, it's on 35 on the way to Duluth, and it has like vertical wooden slats all the way around.
Like really thin and many of them, and it creates like kind of an attractive kind of curving. It's like no siding I've seen on any building before, but maybe I have. But it's very nice looking.
Yeah, it's very cool looking, and it has a wraparound walkway so you can see views of the creek when you're there.
Okay. So this was controversial. I mean, it was an expensive project. So we have the state of Minnesota spending more than $7 million on a rest area. What was that all about? I mean, because there were fiscal conservatives sort of calling this out at the time as sort of an example of waste, essentially, right?
There were folks who were upset that there were delays in this one. But MnDOT maintained that the site hadn't been updated in 50 years, so you can think about that. And also they had to build a new retaining wall and a new sewer system, which added a lot to the cost.
Okay. So we've been talking about these newly renovated rest stops, but there's also, we're getting into this era where things from the 70s can be considered eligible for National Register designation. And some of these are actually on the National Register, right?
Yeah. It goes back 50 years. If you think about the Pizza Hut shape of a building with the roof is kind of this squat shape.
Yeah, it's like it's not a mansard roof, but it's got vibes of that.
Yeah,
this is
yeah.
me trying to be an architect. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, so those are some of the newest ones to be added to the register. And some are eligible. There's a few steps that have to happen first before they actually land on it. But yeah, that's the phase we're in.
Okay. And back to where we started, it's like I feel like when I'm driving, I have to go to the bathroom, I go to a gas station, I can buy some like M&Ms or I don't know, I can buy some like trail mix or something, use the bathroom, maybe get some gas if I need gas. Why should we think more about our wayside rests and rest areas in the state? I mean, I think you've convinced me that they serve a purpose, but give me one last argument.
Well, they're there and you don't have to pay for anything to access them. And they also, gas stations cluster where you're going on and off of major highways, but they may not be spaced out to the same degree. And if you are that type of thrifty traveler who wants to pack a picnic, they're wonderful inviting spots to take a break. Many of them do have vending machines, so you could still get your trail mix.
Okay. All right. And then last part, it's like, what did you hear back from people? I mean, again, we put this out there. If I recall, the morning it went up, we were maybe both a little surprised that this seemed to have a big audience, right? I mean, or at least, was that what happened?
Yeah, it took off to number one read for a little bit there.
Yeah.
And
I was like, oh, okay, there's an audience for the rest area story.
Yeah, and people, I think, feel a sense of pride in our rest areas. And, if you're driving around the country, taking a long road trip, it feels nice to get back to Minnesota.
Cool. All right. Well, Erica, thanks so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Okay, that's it for today's show. Thanks, as always, to Matt Gilmer for editing this podcast. Do you have feedback for us or a question you'd like us to answer? Send us a note at curious@startribune.com. And as always, if you are enjoying this show, please tell a friend about it. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to Curious Minnesota. We want to hear from you. Ask questions and read more stories online at startribune.com/curious. Our show is recorded at the Star Tribune's headquarters in beautiful downtown Minneapolis, and our music is produced by Matt Gilmer. If you like the show, please rate us on iTunes or leave a review. And until next time, stay curious.